And we're rolling. Jeff, what's going on?
It's good to see you, man. I'm pretty impressed with your setup. This is nice.
Well, yeah, it's the COVID podcast studio. That I don't know how many people that happened to, but it seemed like the right thing to do.
Also known as, Yvette says, get the hell out of the house and go do something.
Yeah, quick
Make a
kick,
soundproof room.
quick kicking me out of the office when you're doing podcasts. But
go sit in a soundproof room for the rest of the week.
And don't ask any questions after 11, but ask everybody on the podcast if that's what you need to do. But it's good to see you, man. We were talking last night, and I think it's been 7 years, hasn't it?
It's hard to believe, but it really has. Yeah. And then today when we were talking about, filling out some things for this, yeah, I thought about, you helping me with the transition. I mean, I appreciate that. I don't necessarily think of you that way. I just think of you as a friend and things we've done together, but you really did help me transition from being a soldier into the civilian world and learning how to do certain things and navigate that world. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Oh, you're doing a good job so far, Jeff.
Civilian world is weird, man. It's weird, but,
well, I was trying to remember actually this morning, for listeners, Jeff spent the night last night, came down from Oregon, Port Bend, doing a tour here for what we're talking about today with your skull games, and which we'll get to in a minute. But I was trying to remember how you and I actually met. And I can tell you how we met. I was doing some stuff at Bragg with software and whatnot. And I was briefing some senior leadership at one of the places around there. And it was a closed meeting, only invite people. And one of the guys came up to me and said, "Hey, there's this guy. He's an operator from the place down the road, and he wants to come to this meeting and meet you."
That's right.
And this is going to play into what you do now, Jeff. And I said, I said, well, how the hell does he know about me? This isn't supposed to be out there or whatever. And he's like, look, he's from the place down the road. They hunt people. He knows about you. He's interested. Will you let him come? And I remember you came on that compound, and you were still in the military at that time. And that's how we kicked off our friendship. And you were talking about doing what you've really evolved into now. And you did basically hunt me down, but you've been trained to hunt people down your whole career. So that's how we met. And then we became fast friends. And like you said, you did some stuff out here. And I was like, why did Jeff live at our house for a few months? And I think I remember you had come out here for that transition program at Stanford.
Yeah.
And I said, Jeff, where are you going to live for 3 months? And you said, like, in some place, it was like more like a bunkhouse.
Yeah,
and I was
it was
like,
a hostel.
No, I was like, no, Jeff, you're not going to do that. We have a spare bedroom. And you moved in, and that really kicked it off.
Yeah. I forgot how all that came about as well.
Well, it was a decade ago.
I know. And what's crazy is this full circle thing. I'm so glad that we've reconnected. You make it seem like I disappeared, but I kind of did. You get busy with work, but when I first met you, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do post military and who I was and what were the skills that God had, guided me towards and given me innately, and what did I really like doing. And you already said it. It's hunting people. I mean, even a career in the military. A friend of mine, another operator, used to say, the hunt is better than the kill. And people that fish out there or hunt, like you're a big fisherman, it isn't about the catch. If it was about the catch, not many people would fish. If it was about the kill, not many people would hunt. It's about the activity and the preparation and getting involved in it. And that's how it is with hunting bad people. It's not the catch. It's not the prosecution. It's just the mere fact that you're standing up against them and opposing them. And then once I figured out that that's who I am, I'm a hunter. These things that I was taught in special forces in the military, the Oppresso Liber, that's the motto of special forces, to free the oppressed, and it's on a little badge, and, you say it when you salute. But I began to realize like that it wasn't just a motto to me. Like, to free the oppressed was something that I take that seriously. And I took that as a direct order, not so much a motto. And how do I take that capability and capacity that we largely perfected in the counterterrorism world and the counterinsurgency world in the military, and apply that to a new problem set. And then I definitely felt God calling me into this trafficking space, and I've been pursuing this ever since. It's been a winding road. Again, we've intersected a few times along this winding road, but I think I've landed where God wants me to be, where we have the team and the focus and the insight and the experience to really start to move the needle in this space. And yeah,
Well,
I'm gonna need your help more again. Yep.
I'm excited. Yeah, I was only kidding, tongue in cheek, when I said you disappeared, because you really dive deep into that whole thing, and to get something from 0 to 1 is super hard. So you were doing that, and then I sort of moved out of some government stuff and moved back into the commercial world. And then when I kept, every once in a while you'd pop up on LinkedIn, and I was like, man, I got to get Jeff into this podcast, talk about trafficking, because it's a big thing, which we'll get in today, that basically slavery is still alive in America, that we don't talk about, which we will talk about here. And we'll talk about, I think you're really onto something with Skull Games, making in the game, and hunting people and giving people an outlet who still get out of the military, especially in special forces, and are so used to hunting people. And you go basically from one day you're doing some special operation in some country, doing a high value target, and the next day you're in this civilian world where just not quite the same. So anybody who is conditioned like that is going to go through withdrawal and or be confused even, almost. But you have a cool story, because you have been in so many branches of special forces that not a lot of people that I know and friends normally do that. So maybe we could go back and talk about that. You were in the military for 26 years. You retired out of Delta Force, where you're an operator for what, 15?
10 years.
10 decade. But you went into the Army. When you went into the Army, well, what drew you to the Army?
So I joined the Army right out of high school in 1987. And what's interesting is when you look at special operations soldiers, they're very athletic. They're just one level below like a professional athlete, and you have a life like a professional athlete because your body is so essential in getting the work done. But all of us are just not quite good enough to be a pro. I mean, there's a few guys that were a pro in this or that, but if you're really, really good at something, you become a professional athlete. Well, a special operations soldier, many of us are really good at something, and or a lot of things. That's the other piece of it, is this jack of all trades, this cross-functional capacity, even physically. So I was a runner in high school, but I didn't understand that there was a place for me to run in college. I thought it was, up beyond my reach. So I poured a lot of energy into running. I was a natural leader all my life. I just remembered, even being a little kid, people just, they would follow me. And that's one of those things that we're not going to get to it today on the next podcast. But to me, followership is what's even more amazing than leadership. It's just like, how does someone decide to follow you? And how do you decide to follow someone? And even as a kid, I just remember being in these positions where I was expected to be the leader, So between the leadership and the athleticism, I loved school, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And that sneaky old recruiter, man, he was in the halls at the high school I went to in Milwaukee, and we started talking about special forces. And back then, they didn't have an 18 X-ray program. We have an 18 X-ray program now in special forces, where you can come right off the street or right out of high school and get put into the pipeline. And interestingly, I didn't realize that the 18 X-ray program is the huge feeder program for special forces. I was just at Special Forces Association conference the other week, and it's like 50-60% of Green Berets are coming from the 18 X-ray.
Huh.
So it's kind of like the SEAL program, where you're a civilian one day, and then 6 weeks later, you're a SEAL, or you're
in process.
Yeah. I didn't realize that, because Special Forces has most of the time 3-4 years prior service before you're even eligible. So they didn't have that, but the recruiter convinced me to join Special Forces Reserve. So that was how I initially came in, was under a reserve contract. And then I heard these crazy stories about the Rangers. I'd never heard of Rangers before, And then I saw a Ranger, and the Ranger back then wore the OG 107, the olive drab uniform, like the one that you remember from the Vietnam movies.
Right.
Spit shine boots, black beret. I remember seeing a ranger instructor walking across the compound, and we were all wearing the woodland camouflage. I was so naive when I came in as a private, and I got my hair cut, and they give you a uniform. They give you this woodland camouflage, the BDUs, and I was confused because in all the movies, there were no movies yet with the BDUs. It was all that green uniform from World War II and Korea and Vietnam. So I thought, what was I in for? But as I began to hear these stories about who the Rangers were and what they did, there was a place for me to pivot from what I had initially signed up to do to go straight into the Rangers. And that is really where I feel like I grew up, was as a Ranger, 17 years old, spent 5 years in the 1st Ranger Battalion, and it changed my life.
This was 1987, so this was coming out of Reagan era. We had a lot of planes that were being taken hostage. That's really why Delta, I think, was it 1970? 79 was stood up. Eagle Claw was the first main mission of that unit. And that was a time when all this was happening, and we didn't necessarily have a group of people who were dedicated to go in at that time. And then, so what were the Rangers doing in 87 era that you were there? Were they still taking airfields, or what was the?
Yeah, the charter of the Rangers were the premier airborne infantry, light infantry unit in the world. And truly what they were. So it was still a lot of the Vietnam era, ambush, raid, and then these airfield seizures. That really what they specialized in. And then, of course, in 1989, we seized airfields in Panama. That was my first taste of combat, where we spearheaded that invasion.
You were on that?
I was involved in that.
Oh, wow.
And prior to that, in 1983, the Rangers were involved with Grenada. So we really were this airfield seizure unit, this cordon unit for some of these other specialized organizations, like again with Delta. Really just a shock force, an assault force, but light infantry. So we understood the tactics, and by design, the unit creates these Rangers, or these professional soldiers, into NCOs, and then they're by design go back out in the military and help create just kind of a better cadre. The thing that's crazy, just the other day, I was back in Iraq, and we'll get to that. Doing some of the counter trafficking work, and it was the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of 2003 is when we invaded Iraq, March of 2003. Oh, wow. So I was sitting there thinking, okay, I came in the Army in 1987. You go back 20 years, that's 67. That's the height of the Vietnam War. Like the time when I came in the military to Vietnam is the same where we're sitting now. You think of Panama 1989. What is that? Do the math. 35 years ago. I mean, it's incredible to me that it's that far gone by now. And these Vietnam veterans that I didn't even really bump into barely. They didn't really teach us a lot of the things that they learned, and that's one of my fears, is those of us that really were in the hard years of fighting from 2003 to 2009. Man, those were some crazy combat years. That a lot of that combat knowledge has been slipping away.
The Rangers are generally, and I work with them and I love them, they're just like a super good group of men and women. I actually met one of the first women who became a Ranger, which was fun. I was with John, and she walked through the door of the main place there. He's like, I think that's, and he went up and stopped her because obviously he was a Ranger too. And it was pretty cool, but they're all really younger, right? In general. I mean, these are people out of high school or in their 20s, as opposed, and I'm setting this up for people who don't know this, and some people listening to this that are in special forces know this, but there really is this progression, and your progression as you went through, that you don't become the tier 1 operator out of the gate. Like, they don't take you when you're 20, right? You sort of work your way up through this program.
Yeah. And that's how it is by design. And in fact, I have a little bit of a bone to pick with everybody being called an operator.
Let's talk about that.
Well, when I came in, you were a Ranger. And that I was proud to be a ranger. I wasn't an operator. An operator was reserved very specifically for Delta Force. You were a Delta Force operator.
Mm.
In Special Forces, you were a Special Forces Green Beret. I was proud of that. This idea of an operator was reserved for this, not this unit. It was kind of tied to the unit, but it's really this level of experience. And I think that's what you're hitting at,
Yeah.
is at an 18, 19, 20-year-old soldier, a ranger, I was damn good. But I was a 19, 20-year-old kid. As a 38-year-old, 39-year-old Delta Force operator, to me, operator brings along with it this vast experience. You've traveled the world, you've been in front of ambassadors and congressmen, and you understand how to navigate all of these different dynamics. So I lament the fact that we call all these young soldiers operators, a ranger is an operator, an Air Force pararescue guy is an operator, even a Navy SEAL that's an operator. Like, look, we're to me, words matter. And again, we're both in our 50s now. I am a more confident, more capable man than I've ever been. Even as our bodies decline a little bit and what
Mine's
we can
not
do
declining,
physically.
but go ahead.
You know, but you make up for it in knowledge and wisdom. You know, so that is exactly right. The kind of the natural progression is from Rangers, and many of them go straight into Delta Force, and then the other option is Rangers into Special Forces and then Delta Force.
But that I haven't heard it. Not that I know everything, but I that's a unique thing to be all three, isn't it? Or maybe for your cohort, your age, our generation, when you were there, maybe they did that. I didn't think people went to Special Forces or Green Berets between them. But was that something that a lot of Rangers did when you were there?
Not a lot of Rangers went Special Forces when I was there. And even as a young Ranger, I looked down upon the Special Forces. I mean, it's kind of, you
Why?
build these teams, you build these tribes, and part of what builds a Ranger and who a Ranger is because he's convinced he's bulletproof. And a young man who's 19, 20.
Yeah, we all thought we were bulletproof, whether we're in the military or not.
And you capitalize on that. Again, in your late 30s, getting into your 40s, everyone realizes you're not bulletproof. So there's a whole new style of understanding warfare that has to come into play. Well, when I was a Ranger, I didn't understand what the mission of Special Forces were. You rarely saw the A teams. So the operational attachment alphas, those guys are out working, right? You're not bumping it into them. So when you're on Fort Bragg or Fort Campbell, you're seeing a lot of the support. You're not seeing the guys that are actually the tip of the spear. And then as a young Ranger, we also really focused on appearance. Spit shine boots, dude. If you had I still walk. When I walk, I still touch my legs to make sure that none of my pockets are undone. And I'm not even wearing pants with pockets, but it's trauma that was inflicted upon me if I have a boot lace. So it was so part of being a young Ranger, because you're a young man that needs that level of discipline. Everything was absolutely pristine. So when you see some Special Forces guy who's wearing tennis shoes with his uniform, or his buttons are unbloused and he's got half a beard, I thought that guy was a total shitbag. You know what I mean? I didn't understand. This is a professional in a different space. And it totally changed my opinion when I went to scuba school, and the professionalism that I saw of Special Forces. An amazing school in Key West, an amazing blend of physical requirements, mental requirements, intestinal fortitude. I mean, it was an amazing school, and it changed my whole perspective.
Because they were there when you were training?
It's a Special Forces school. They're the cadre. So the Ranger at Special Forces combat diver course, that's the rare animal. Most of the other guys are Special Forces guys. So I began to understand much more of how I was having an inaccurate look. The other thing I would say, as an NCO, it's pretty easy to jump right from Rangers into going to the unit. As an officer, you have to be branch qualified. You have to be a captain. You have had to have had a company command or something equivalent. So I loved special ops so much, and I liked small unit leadership so much, I didn't want to go out to the big army. I didn't want to command a company of 150 guys. So a lot of the officers in the unit are Special Forces. They come from,
uh,
infantry,
because they
ranger.
needed
Right.
that rotation to lead some bigger group.
You've got to get that qualification. And then the other thing that I would say is even the rangers that go into the unit, many of them become Q course qualified. They become special forces because it's a different promotion rate as well.
Oh,
So if you're either being promoted with the rest of the U.S. Army infantry, or you're being promoted in kind of these special forces things. So there are very few straight infantry guys left in the unit because it's harder
to make it.
to be promoted into that.
And was it you seeing those Green Berets at diver school that inspired you to go to the, like, did you even know that Delta existed? I mean, some people that I know say they didn't even know that these units existed. And then they would meet somebody or see somebody downrange and then say, oh, well, what is that? Like, you see these Green Berets at dive school where you're like, hey, I'm going to go get out of the Rangers and do that.
So my first experience with the unit, I was running a range. I think we were at Fort Campbell, if I remember correctly, and it was a heavy weapons range. And I get the call. My safety officer says, "Hey, we need to shut down the range. Another unit's coming in that has priority." And I'm like, "I'm a ranger, by God. Who's bumping this ranger NCO from the range that we laid on?" So I'm sitting there waiting, and this Black Hawk helicopter lands, and these dudes jump out wearing jeans and kind of quasi civilian clothes, and they bring these big black duffel bags, and they have all these assortment of exotic M203 grenade launchers. The old classic, the ones from Vietnam, and they come out and they have their ammo and they shoot a bunch of it, and they're all old dudes, and they're taking notes, and they're on the range for like an hour. And then they say, "Hey, thanks. Sorry for interrupting you guys. We really had to get this in. Really appreciate it." We shake hands and they leave. And I said, "Who are those guys?" And then I find out that's Delta Force. And that was my first impression. One, they were professional. Two, it seemed like they were doing whatever the hell they wanted to do, and thirdly, they trumped anything I was doing as a Ranger NCO. So as I began to dig into it more, and we never talked about it. I mean, there were all these names, the D boys, the guys behind the fence. There were all these names for them, but it was much more of a classified operation and unit. Even when I went there in 2005, you didn't say the word Delta Force. I mean, it wasn't something.
Well,
you
no,
said.
that's what you and I talked about beforehand. I was like, hey,
Yeah.
are you comfortable? I still, and I wasn't in the military for listeners, but I did work in the space. I still, like, there's a piece of me every time we talk about it. It's like,
yeah,
but it is out there. It's on the papers. It is talked about now. And in fact, the crazy part, which I said to you at dinner last night, because we were talking about books, and you have a new book coming out, which I want to mention, which we are going to talk about, called Where Have All the Heroes Gone? A Pilgrimage Through the Bible, Battlefield, and Back Again. So we're going to talk about that because I didn't know about that until you showed up last night and sprung that on us. But the book where I really started to learn about all this, and the reason I learned it is because my family was in the Army and I wanted to be in Delta Force.
Really?
Oh yeah, I got an appointment to West Point out of high school and didn't go because I had, at the time, was having my third ACL. They recruited me out of I was second in my class. I played lacrosse at a very good boys Latin in Baltimore. It's a good lacrosse school, high school. And they're like, hey, look, you're going to have a great, my dad was in the Army, my grandfather was in the Army, like there is a Navy person there with an uncle, but mostly Army. And I grew up wearing those Army clothes. My dad was in the reserves. Like, I grew up with all, you can look at my kid picture. So I was like, yeah, I want to go into the Army and I want to do Delta Force. And they're like, hey, look.
How did you even know about it?
Well, I just knew there was a book by Charlie. So going back to what we talked about at dinner last night, there's like this, hey, don't say that. Use the 5,000 code words that nobody can remember which one or whatever. And I'm like, there's this book called The Delta Force by Shelley Beckworth, who founded Delta Force, which explains everything. In fact, the name of the book on the front cover is Delta Force. And I was always like, what are we talking about here? This guy founded this place. And the truth is, Jeff, that at the time when I was in high school, which was 90s, I could have mistaken the A team for Delta Force. it was, I grew up probably like you with GI Joe,
Yeah.
all these things. So I basically was like, hey, I just want to be at the top. I want to be the best. And they're like, hey, look, you're going to have a great career in the Army. You're going to be a great officer, but likelihood of you with 3 ACLs. I wore a knee brace back then. Technology wasn't. They're like, probably not going to happen for you. And I was like, well, that's really the only reason I'm coming. So yeah, I didn't go.
Well, that was my route as well. So once I found out about the unit, that's what I wanted to do. But my eyes were not correctable to the standard that they had. So that's
Oh,
why I got out after 5 years. I was planning on going to the unit. I had gotten a waiver to do scuba school, to do sniper school, like to do all these schools. You just get a waiver. So I assumed, well, of course it's waiverable. There's no reason to hold to this vision standard, but they would not let me go. So when I got out of the military after 5 years, I was angry ranger. I didn't have my way, but I had at that point I had a couple of friends who were in the unit, so I began to understand a little bit more about who they are and what they do. And yeah, there's much about the unit we should not talk about, and
oh
and
yeah,
it's
right,
it's
of
it's
course.
it's nobody's business. It's and if you want to know about it, then
Go
then
join.
go then go fucking do what needs to be done to get there.
Which,
But
by the way, just for listeners, because not everybody listening to this is going to be in the military, understand this isn't a, hey, you fill out the form and get in. This is like super hard. What is there, like 98% failure? I mean,
yeah,
most people don't make it. We can't say the number. There have been so few of you
yeah,
that it's ridiculous since 1978 or 79 that, but I just want it for listeners say, you've said like, hey, Rangers like move on. It's not that. This
it,
selection process is,
it's an amazing place, and um, with the wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, we opened up our doors considerably because the basis of the unit is that operator, that assaulter, right? Well, to spearhead these wars and share our knowledge, we became much more like a special forces unit. So the other interesting thing when you think of Delta, people, it's first SFODD, first Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. It's a special forces unit. It's not a ranger unit. It's not an infantry unit. Like you talked about back in 79 with the hijackings and the recognition that we didn't have an organization that was very specific to be a counterterror element. We would have these ad hoc groups that we would throw together, and they were successful, but then they would disband. So the decision was made, we need to make a detachment Delta that is focused 100% on counterterrorism. Well, that's what we were focused on up until around 2001 when 9/11 occurred. Now you are this organization that is expected to integrate with the battlefield, with the warfare. So we opened things up. We started to talk about it a lot more. And I'm kind of in that space. So the book that we're talking about, I expect it back over the next couple of days from as a security clearance from the unit, because there are certain things we should not talk about. There are things that we can talk about, like the fact that I was in Delta Force. I can talk about that. There are things in general that I can talk about. So, some guys that are still in the unit, they get angry and they say you should never say that or whatever. My litmus test is one, obviously, if it's operational security, shut your mouth. Like that's ridiculous,
right.
you know. And the other one too is like self gain. The book that I've written, the reason I talk about Delta Force, it's not for me. I'm happy with being called a
Jeff.
special forces guy, or whatever. Jeff, yeah, quite simply,
Jeff, the guy who
yeah.
served in the military.
But I think it's important that people know, like you're saying, there's this other group out there that is the pinnacle of warriors. There has never been in the history of the world a more capable, lethal warrior force than this unit. And I'm not in competition with SEAL Team 6 and all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like they're a terrific unit as well, but we're just different, and we view warfare differently, and we view the potential of warfare and how to defeat your enemies in a different way. And I'm very proud of that. I think there are things that we need to share with the public about that. And then what is also important to me is our mates as they leave. You are assessed and selected and trained to come into that unit, and you are expected to carry a heavy, heavy load. You pay for it physically, relationally, emotionally, spiritually. You pay a heavy price to be in the unit. And is it worth it? Hell yeah, it's worth it. I'm broke as hell. I just had
well,
my second hip
well,
replacement. You know what I mean?
well, yeah.
You
When
know,
you came out of the van yesterday, and I hadn't seen you in a few years, and you were limping, I was like, God, did Jeff really age like that? But then I was like, God, all those missions, and then one thing for listeners, when Jeff lived with us, he would reenact some stuff, and my lovely poor wife sometimes got the gruesome thing. I'm not going to repeat one thing that you said, but it was back when we were in the kitchen one day, and you're like, yeah, this happened. And I remember her sitting on the couch, and she'd be like, what, Jeff? You're like, yeah, that's what happened. And she's like, oh my God. And then last night you were telling us how your chute didn't open, and you had a little accident with your hip there. And she's like, oh my God. But I'm actually very glad to hear that you actually had your hip replaced just 5 weeks ago, and that thing is not going to be permanent. But the physical tear on anybody's body at that level is really,
well, and
it's
that's
really
where,
high.
that's where I feel, I want to talk about certain aspects of this. One, for our mates as they get out, because it's a whole focus. Like you are 100% focused on being that operator. I mean, the
As
country,
you should be.
the country demand, and again, as a leader in that organization, dude, my job was to take men and women into combat, prosecute those targets successfully, and take them home. Like, do you not think my wife and kids paid a heavy, heavy price for me for doing that for 15 plus years between special forces and the unit? But uh, guys need to have that new passion and purpose. When they take that uniform off, what do they do next? And we're starting to see a little bit of aimlessness from Rangers and special forces and guys coming out of the unit. And I want to be able to help guide them and help them understand and recognize it's not about the uniform. It's about the things you learned. It's about the teamwork and the communities that you built. So that's part of what I think is a mission for me, and that's why I'm a little bit more open to talk about it than some other people, because it breaks my heart that we're losing soldiers to suicide,
Which is happening daily.
and it's starting to hit the ranks of the highest levels in special operations. I thought we were a little bit immune from that for a while. It really didn't hit our ranks, but it did hit our ranks, and we've got a lot of guys that are struggling. So we've got to find a way to talk about who we are and what we did and what inspired us without breaking that bond and that trust of the mates that are still there fighting the fight.
I think that's what bothered me the most when I was working more in the government realm and met all you guys and women, and I felt like our government in general, and this isn't evil. This is like, yeah, you need to be trained to be the best warrior possible. You should not think about anything else all day, every day. Not to mention, we're putting you and other people in almost unfathomable, unwinnable in most cases situations, and you're expected to believe you can. It's almost like I don't want to say it's equivalent to being an entrepreneur, because my wife's always like she says last night, Brandon, these people can die. I was like, well, I sort of felt like I was dying a lot, but not with a gun or a bullet. But you are literally putting yourself in a situation where you have to believe you can do which appears to not be possible.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do that, it just takes a certain amount of training, mind conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. But what I have witnessed, and it's why I volunteer a lot of my time, and I think when you were like, yeah, I'm going to live in a hostel, I was like, you're not living in a hostel. We do a terrible job, we as a country, moving people from this day of mission to day in the civilian life. And the civilian life is very different. I can remember, I'm not going to name names, but we were having I remember my first um, real, well, I think one of the barbecues we had, and some of the guys are like, yeah, well, Brandon, I'm just going to become an entrepreneur and going to make a bunch of money. And you did it. So, and I was thinking like, yeah, like I get it. You should believe that, but it's a lot harder than you think. But what I don't think the government does is provide that perspective. Like, maybe you get 6 months or 8 months to transition out, but they're not really transitioning you. They're allowing you to do the 5,000 pages of paperwork that you guys and women have to do to get out of that thing. And they don't really put you into a program. They basically say, hey, we've invested the money. You did what you did. Now go figure it out. Well, go figure it out is, if you program someone, you should unprogram them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you agree with that?
I agree 100%. And we're doing better at that. And for me, and we'll talk about this also.
Yeah, we're going to go back to your story, Green Beret, and then move on, and then we'll come around to it.
For me, as I began to recognize it was time to move towards retirement, things were happening. My boys were getting older. I was looking at my sons saying, if I do another couple years, dude, they're going to be gone. My wife had some health issues that we were dealing with. So
you had to serve 26 years at that point, basically.
Yeah, I mean, and quite honestly, like I said, I'm a small unit leader. I did not want to run an organization. It's kind of like this the player coach kind of a thing. I liked being a player. I like being a player coach. I like being a coach. I don't want to be the general manager. So that was all part of it. And so my wife and I I took a job in Jerusalem, Israel, and I worked that job for close to 2 years, and that was a huge transition piece for me. But prior to that, I mean, Brandon, we had guys that would come home from a deployment, and 3 weeks later, they're civilians. I mean, we didn't look at that. So we have a much better transition program and process.
And I'm not picking on one unit. I see this across.
Oh yeah,
Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, everybody, but even intelligence world.
And we're providing these opportunities, but I still think we're missing the boat. Like here's one thing. Like for someone to say, "Well, I'm going to be an entrepreneur." Well, here's the deal. Very few of us in the military care about money.
Well, we just don't need to.
Well, and it isn't the driving force. In business, it's about money. So if you're already coming into this as a 45-year-old man who joined the military when he was 17, I couldn't care less about money. I've never known how much money I make. My wife takes care of it. Like she could have an offshore bank account and be a gazillionaire right now. I would have no idea. But so now all of a sudden in your late 40s, you're going to pivot to understanding what it really means to prioritize money and income and profits. That's just it's not who we are. And it's that rare animal that can make that transition. And again, that's where I thank you for helping me see that. And I'm in that nonprofit space because it's just more of who I am. To me, the benefits are what you're actually doing out there versus, the money that you're counting. But it still leans on money. I can't do anything good with the nonprofit work that I'm doing without someone else's money. So I think that's why, I'm glad to be here and talk about this stuff and help folks recognize and understand we're different animals. Like very often I feel like I'm a fish out of water here in the civilian world. Like you talk about, the lying, like, dude, honor, integrity, honesty, valor, all of those things, like it's not just a list of words. That's how I lived my life. And I didn't think I was naive, but I look back at it now. I was naive. I just thought men carried themselves differently. They treated women differently. They related to each other. I would never backstab you. I mean, it's so dishonorable. Trust, all these things that were the watchwords in my life. They're not as important out here. And I go back and forth between lamenting that and then trying to celebrate those people that still live it, which again, that's what the story of my book is where have all the heroes gone? And they're out there. We're just not celebrating them. And it's not physical valor, me jumping in front of a bullet, taking a bullet for you. It's me not screwing you over in business and being honest with you, and me being faithful to my wife and to my children. Brandon, to me, that's what's heroic. Almost any man will run into a burning building and save a little kid. But that same guy is not claiming 3 children that he had with 3 different women. Where's the honor in that? Where's the heroism in that?
Well, I think that gets probably do a whole podcast on that, Jeff. I think society sort of got off track. I'm a big believer that that's taught at home, and if it's not taught at home, then it's very hard to get it from school or anywhere else. And I don't really care what people say that they blame it on schools and do all that. It happens at home. Those are the people, and we talked about this, and we will here in a minute about even these victims who are abused at home, sold for basically sex slaves, and they still, and Yvette was saying it last night from being a child enforcement social services when we first met agent, they don't want to leave home,
Yeah.
even with the abuse. So if they don't see it at home, then you're not going to get this product that you're talking about. And, humans are out here are incentivized by money, and sometimes that just takes a different route. And I think, and not just money, but also power.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate the power of power.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. It isn't money. It's
It's also
it's what
power.
money.
There's a lot
It's
of
what
drug.
money brings:
Yeah,
power and control and influence.
I always say, like, what brings down drug dealers? They have more money than they ever need, but it's not the money.
Yeah.
It's the power, it's the influence. And if you look at anyone who just takes it too far, they could have got away. And I don't mean it's right, but they could have walked away with what they did.
Yeah.
But they don't, because they want more, and they want more. But coming back to the story, and then we'll come around to the trafficking stuff and what you're doing, which I think is really important. And I think what we talked about last night, your organization is really the only organization that's actually producing some sort of result in the way of capturing these child traffickers or slavery people. I don't know what the right word is, but just to wind up for listeners, your story, you become a ranger, you get out because of your eyesight, you get back in, you met Green Berets at the swim training in Key West, and then you come back into the military and decide that you're going to be Special Forces Green Beret, and you're going to become an officer at that point.
Yep. So when I had my break in service, lo and behold, there is a place for my level of talent in running. So if I would have known that I could have ran D1 level sports, in cross country and track, I probably would never even join the Army. So when I got out, I realized I can run D1 track cross country. So I started at University of North Carolina in Wilmington, and then transferred out to Montana State University. And while I was at Montana State, I was studying psychology, and I really felt a draw to get back to this community. I missed that community, and I was looking at where could I fit in. Okay, if I can't be an operator in something like Delta Force, what is it that I think we're lacking? And I back then in the mid 90s, I thought we were lacking assessment selection from a psychological point of view, organizational psychology, building these teams. So I began to study psychology and decided I was going to come back in, come back in as an officer and be a psychologist and go help Rangers, Special Forces, and ultimately the unit better understand how to assess, select, and train their personnel. And then I got a call from this friend of mine that I talked about earlier, who had been in the unit since the early 90s. And he said kind of flippantly, "Oh, hey, they're accepting guys with the corrective surgery now." And I went to my ROTC instructor. I was on an educational delay. I was supposed to go out to grad school for psychology. I said, "Hey, stop everything. I'm going infantry. I'm going back." So I wanted that route to be Rangers, Special Forces, and Delta, and it worked out fine. One thing I wanted to go back to real quick though was, because we started this discussion on using this term Delta Force and being open about it and talking about it in a certain degree. And this book that I've written, it really started out as a passion project of my experiences in Israel. And not only is the Bible important to me for my faith tradition, I study it as a piece of history.
Yeah, you were telling me that, and I
literature.
These stories behind the story that even people going to church and going to Bible school didn't know.
Yeah, so that's what it started as. And then I started to weave in some of how these stories played out in my life, how betrayal and honor and fear and relationship, how these Bible stories that are universals for all of us really played out in my life. And then as the time went on, I really began to understand that I'm writing this book for my sons, because I almost tear up talking about this. They don't know me. They don't know huge parts of me, you know? And that's the way it should be when you're in a special operations unit, when you're in a unit like Delta Force, especially when you're in combat. I mean, I would disappear 3 or 4 or 5 months at a time and go off to war. And I needed to protect my sons from that. And they needed to understand why I wasn't there, and they're now beautiful men, 25 and 23-year-old, just kind, brave. I mean, just remarkable young men. And I attribute a lot of that to my wife. But I also attribute a lot of that to the way that we kept our secrets and we kept them safe, But I don't want to leave this planet without my boys really knowing who I am and who I was and what I did to a degree and why I will drop anything to go help one of these mates still. If one of my guys, friends from Rangers or Special Forces or the unit calls me and says they need me, dude, I'll drop everything. I'm going. And how is it that in many ways they're more important to me than my wife and sons are? How does that happen? Well, war does that. When you put your life in someone else's hands like that, you get these real lopsided relationships that are hard to explain. So that's another reason that I want to talk about this more. It's for my sons, and it's for those sons and daughters out there. Our good friend Billy Dean, who passed away, he has 2 daughters out there. They're never going to know him the way you and I knew him, and they're never going to know him on what he did in the military unless people like us begin to share some of these stories. And again, I'm not talking about OPSEC. I'm not talking about
Right.
the things that are putting,
Right. We're not going to talk about.
yeah, but the ideas behind it and the struggle and the relationships and the commitment and the courage.
And the strategy, to be
Yeah.
honest with you, Jeff. Some of those, I rode bikes with Bill. Obviously didn't get to know him that long, but a few years. And I was always fascinated that the stories of the strategy. And when I was in those rooms listening to the strategy, I'm like, wow, there's a lot more to this than I ever
Yeah.
expected. I was actually sitting, the Rangers invited me to a closed dinner when they were in DC once. And I remember and I think it was Brandon who was in charge then, but, or maybe he was going to be, I forget. And I was sitting at this table and they start talking, Jeff, and they're talking about things that like are in the news, but not in the news.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sitting there thinking, holy mackerel, man, like this is not the perception that, and it would even me being in the flow and having been in those and being in that situation, not just for the moment, but having been involved in it, it would always almost be surreal to me, Jeff, to sit back and say, the outer world looks at operators or Rangers or Special Forces or Marines, whoever, SEALs, as with a gun.
Mm-hmm.
But there's actually less gunfight
Mm-hmm.
and more strategy than you would ever imagine. And what's always struck me, and this isn't, I probably know more of you guys than I do Navy people or
Mm-hmm.
someone else, but how well read.
Mm.
And I don't mean that to be like, oh, well, I just expected you guys were a bunch of knuckle draggers shooting guns. It was like really well read on this crazy stuff that you just don't get a glimpse of because nobody talks about that, or some of it maybe can't be talked about. But I think there's so much more and it's so much deeper that I think the American public, and it's not my responsibility, nor do I feel a mission to convince someone who keeps telling me I'm crazy that, but I think it would benefit American civilians to understand more about what goes into that, to appreciate what it means. And I say this half jokingly, but not really, that you're going to drive from today down the coast to Monterey or wherever to meet someone. And I just don't think you're going to get worried about being blown up. And I just, that's not a coincidence. There's a lot of people behind the scenes that are doing things to make sure that that is the case. And I had a friend, I won't name him, actually from Half Moon Bay, say to me, well, Brandon, those people would never come here. And I'm like, okay, well, probably I'm not going to take this one on, but
Yeah.
if that like, but I think that depth of understanding of the strategy and whatnot, and going back to you wanting your boys to understand that, and even Bill's daughters, who
Yeah.
maybe through someone like you who
Mm-hmm.
was right next to him,
Mm-hmm.
right,
Mm-hmm.
can say, okay, there was more to dad than maybe what our perception is. And he didn't say that, or they were little smaller, but didn't say that, one, to protect us, maybe mentally, and two, is to physically protect you, because
Yeah.
that connection, and which we'll get to when you hunt people, you find the connection, you pull the string, you find the weak point.
And
I didn't
for
mean to go off on a
no,
tirade
I
there.
agree with you, and I think for our listeners that didn't quite understand when we said the hunt is better than the kill, that's what we're talking about is the strategy of all of it, and that's where when I stood back and looked at what I was good at, it's solving those problems, it's making these decisions, it's shaping the environment so you can win, and to pick all that up, all that strategy, and apply that to counter sex traffickers, that's my endeavor. I'm a big jiu-jitsu guy, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and it's the same thing. People understand the physicality of jiu-jitsu, but it's really the mental game. It's the strategy. It's taking you to places where you're uncomfortable. It's me getting that slight advantage. There's a famous quote by Sun Tzu: if you know your enemy, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you need not fear the result of 1,000 battles. And you know, you go in. This is what we talk about. You go into the corporate world, and those are big. There's that. That's a poster on the wall, and people say it in the military all the time. But what people don't think about is knowing yourself. That's a lifelong pursuit. You know how many people out there don't know
It's
themselves?
really hard.
And the journey of a young ranger, you begin to know yourself. You know your strengths and your weaknesses. Special forces is just another step. These assessment and selection programs, they're there, yes, so I can evaluate you. Do I believe you have what it takes to come into my ranks? Yes, it's external point of view, but it's also very much an internal. Brandon, you have to know who you are. You have to know your strengths and weaknesses, and you can't bullshit yourself. And now when you get to something like the unit, you've gone through most of those other ones already. So you already know who you are, but it's that refinement. And now you've added on kind of these other levels. So knowing yourself is a very, very difficult thing. It's a lifelong pursuit. And then knowing your enemy is the same deal. Studying your enemy and knowing your enemy and understanding your enemy and how to beat them at their own game is also a lifelong pursuit, because they continue to pivot. Your enemy is your adversary. He's your opponent. They're not static. They learn from you just as much as you learn from them. So, yep, to take all of that and put that against who I think are the most disgusting human beings on the planet.
Yeah, why not?
And these people I'm going to meet tomorrow or later today, I was just reading through again, doing my homework, understand who they are, where they come from, what their passions are. She used this term, predators for profit, and I've never thought about that before. So we talk about pimps, we talk about traffickers, we talk about these guys that buy sex, and I use this term as a predator. But I'm going to ask her when I see her today if I can adopt that term. A pimp and a trafficker is a predator for profit. They're not just taking advantage and exploiting the vulnerable. They're doing it for a profit. So that's where I think it's disgusting. Al Qaeda, ISIS, look, a lot of those guys are thugs, but some of them believe in their cause. Some of them, those fundamentalists, they believe they're doing the right thing from a religious point of view. Some of them do. Dude, there isn't a pimp or a trafficker out here on the planet that thinks he's doing the right thing.
No, they know what they're doing, and we'll use that to the transition. I do want to say one thing with that analogy, and we'll sort of get you from out of the unit to what you started
Mm-hmm.
doing chasing sex traffickers or predators for profit. Really, is I think what you just described is and you'll have to hold me back from going. Maybe we have to hold ourselves back from going down a tangent about society, but that education, um, process to get to know yourself as a person, not just a man. There's women that go through this too. Um, is not something that society seems, in general, in the civilian world, to do anymore.
Yeah.
It's almost as if we are deciding that we're going to let young people become wild animals. I know that sort of sounds crazy, but I grew up on the East Coast. I always say it's one of the 13 original colonies, so it's a little colonial in that way. Um, and I always felt that it was a real path. And I was talking to my mom recently because I always wanted to come to California. California is the Wild West, like Silicon Valley. There's no rules, right?
Yeah.
There's almost no, there's not etiquette. It's just, hey, let's much more open to discussing these things and sort of figuring it out. And I always wanted to do that. And I was like, God, I'm really just so glad I live here now. And she's like, well, actually, Brandon, you feel like that, but the fact that you have both actually makes you much more prepared, able, and capable than anyone, because you've been through this.
Mm-hmm.
You've been through this thing where you sort of brought up, and I don't have trouble with who I am, mainly because maybe I was forced to figure that out.
Yeah.
In many ways. And when you don't figure that out, you become susceptible to suggestions. You become susceptible to your insecurities because you're not even aware of your own insecurity, like being able to identify that you did that or said that or reacted that way because of your insecurity. Like, if you can't do that and you don't have that self-awareness, you are going to go down a path that you otherwise might not have gone down. And I think society has, I don't know what's happened. And I try to really think about on my bike a lot, like, well, parents and old people, Jeff, always like, oh, well, back when I was young.
Mm-hmm.
But is it really that? Because if we look at where things have gone and what the military did in your progression and in most of that progression, and it's not all good. There's some negative stuff in there, but it did allow you to figure out who you are.
Yeah.
And when you do know who you are, life is actually not as hard to live.
Right.
Right. Because I know what I don't want to say the line. I don't want to say I have rules, but I know what my code is.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when I'm getting close and what decision I'm willing to make at that juncture.
Yeah.
And, that what we're talking about here is, in the civilian world, Jeff, it's Tony Robbins, self-help, like old school Jim Rohn. It's these programs almost, if you will, that try to help you discover who you are. And if we don't do that, like, society is just going to be lost.
And I may be an optimist on this. I am certainly not the old curmudgeon kids these days, And
yeah, I'm not saying that.
No, and you're not, and I want
to
caution.
But I am trending there.
Well, but I want to caution our generation from doing that, because again, I'm a big history buff, and history repeats itself, and every generation says that about the next generation, and it just becomes that new normal. Do I understand these relationships and this obsession with social media and all of this stuff? I don't. And there are many things that I kind of frown upon. But one of the advantages I have, and I mentioned this earlier, is I have my two sons, right? And they are better, kinder, they're just better men than I was at their age. You know what I mean? I was rough around the edges. I mean, anyway, they're good men, and their friends are good men, and the women that they've aligned themselves are good women. There's so much noise out there. We don't celebrate these good people. And I've had a discussion with you since I've been here. These interns, these people that you are pouring into, there are incredible young people out there. This next generation is incredible. And I think the pendulum swings back and forth, and we've left them with nothing. We have We tell them religion doesn't exist, genders don't exist, relationship.
Well, that's what I'm trying to
yeah,
say. Like, it's easy to get
right.
lost on this stuff.
I agree. But there are plenty of these young people that are finding
No,
themselves,
you are right.
and again, for those of you that are out there listening, I don't know what to tell you. I have two boys. They're 25 and 23, and they are some of the most beautiful human beings I've ever met in my life. And they will stand up for you, and they will protect you, and they accept all of these things, the diversity, equity, inclusion. Absolutely. I mean, they accept all these things in a much more natural way than our generation. Yeah, and when you were talking about Half Moon Bay, there's that famous quote by George Orwell: "People sleep peaceably in their beds at night because rough men stand on the wall prepared to do violence," or something like that. And that's where, yeah, I was a rough man. I was a rough man on that wall, and it wasn't as simplistic as standing on the wall. It wasn't. It was the hours and hours of research and study and testing and building and teamwork and training, so that when I did need to defend from that wall, we won every time. And that's the lesson that I want to instill into my boys. It's not just the simple fact that you're standing on the wall. You're prepared
Well, I think that's an
to stand on
important,
that wall.
and you see two things with that. One is, there's a famous colonel who said, if you lost the battle, you weren't prepared, or there's some, I have to look it up. I'll put it in the show notes because I think it's important. But the other thing is one thing that you mentioned, and then we'll move on, is you're going down to this meeting to meet some people, and you're reading their perspective so that you understand the lens of which they will talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
And today we do not do that.
Mm.
And that is what creates a divide. I think it's magnified itself greatly. And that's what you and me and Vet were talking about last night. Like, I don't even know what parties mean anymore. I mean, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
I really couldn't tell you. And I think it's because of the extremes.
Yeah.
But what's happened is, whether it's social media or whatever it is, it has not taught, like when we were in back when we were in kids debate school, maybe it's still big. But the thing with debate was that you had to prepare both sides, and you picked out of the hat what you were going to defend.
Right.
And that really changed everything.
Yeah.
Because now you have to know both sides to be able, because you don't know what you're going to defend. In today's world, whatever's being taught, we're not teaching that you need to look through their lens. You might not agree.
Yeah.
But allowing you to see their experience and that changes everything.
Well, I think you're right. And somewhere where things have kind of drifted towards is people are defining themselves by what they're against. They're not defining themselves by what they're for. Just like,
they don't know what they're for.
Right. And I can explain to you the two predominant political parties by what they're against.
Right.
I really don't understand what they're for. And I think that's again where I think young people this day and age, they're beginning to try to understand that and realize that. And I think that pivot to your identity isn't what you're against. It's what you're for, goes a long ways.
All right, well, let's come back around. You do the special forces, you go to the unit, you serve 10 years in really hard combat, which we didn't, but those were all war years, right? You were in Iraq,
Yeah.
Afghanistan, and other places around the world. You decide to retire and you get out. And I think and this sort of comes full circle when I started the show saying how we met, which maybe an hour into it makes sense. It is, you were talking to me some stuff about the DoD and whatnot, but also about you were going to get out and chase these predators in human trafficking. And with the idea that people getting out can now take that energy of, and I call it hunting people. I think that's really raw, but I think it's actually what, it's what it is.
Yeah.
Right. Like you hunted bad people, terrorists. And now that you're out of the DoD, you still want to take that energy and that to be quite candid, skill set
Mm-hmm.
to be able to hunt down somebody else bad that takes this energy and still allows you, instead of just stopping it and saying, okay, Jeff, well, I'd love for you to work for our software company and you're going to put on your shirt today and we're going to teach you that. Like, that's really hard to get your head around. And you were going to go chase these child trafficking when you had educated me, really. And I still, last night, you and I were talking about this, still, it still amazes me that the public doesn't understand this. And maybe they understand it or they don't care or they don't see it. I don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, really, that's really going on here in the United States. And even last night, you corrected me about 5 times because I'm saying, oh, well, they're bringing the people over. They're bringing the people into the country. And you're like, yeah, no. So you've evolved into this where we are now, Skull Games. Let's talk about human trafficking, which is what you're hunting people who are taking, mostly men, maybe there's madams, I don't know, taking advantage of women in these escort service sites, or it's really not an escort, but that's what they're advertising themselves as. This isn't prostitution. You're not dealing with the prostitution. You're dealing with basically people who are keeping white women, quite candidly, which we can talk about, as slaves.
Yeah.
And then selling them. And basically, and you know, it's sort of, and I'll let you talk here, because this sparked a nerve with me last night when you said, well, we've really made women's bodies a commodity. And I was like, huh, that's interesting, that's basically what this has come down to, that at any time, anybody, man or woman, can buy a woman for a night, a day, a week, or whatever. And it's not that hard.
Yeah.
And it's sort of shocking. And probably some people are listening and being like, oh, well, that's crazy, or that doesn't happen, but it's happening every day.
So again, to tie together what we talked about, knowing yourself and understanding that, you know, and I would challenge our listeners, take a minute, maybe not right now, but take a minute today and think about how you would describe yourself in one word. And what I've arrived at is a protector. I'm a protector. I do that physically. I do that emotionally. I do that spiritually. I do that intellectually for myself, for my family, and those that are around me. So that's how I define who I am in a single word. So what needs protecting? And I don't think there's anything more precious on our planet than women and children. You know, when God created women, that was his masterpiece. He, like, you know, peace, I'm out. That's it. It's the best I got. You know what I mean? Like, it's the crown jewel. And it's not a coincidence that women are the creatures that give birth to children. So women and children are our most precious commodity. And I really believe that. And I get frustrated because people, they kind of give that lip service, you know, what about the children? What about the children? Well, as a community, as a culture in America, we do not respect and cherish our children in the way we should. We do not respect and cherish our women in the way that we should. Like you said, we've commoditized them in many ways.
Or actually making them become irrelevant. I mean, I don't want to get into this, but I will mention it because it's on my mind. So sorry. I read the article this morning when I got up that there's this transgender, and I'm not against transgender, anything. You can do whatever you want.
Agreed.
Like, I don't even want to know my heterosexual friends what they're doing in their bedroom. Like, don't tell me, Jeff. I just don't want to know. Like, do your thing. But when it infringes on someone else's space in a way that changes their life trajectory, it bothers me.
Yeah.
And the article this morning was just happened to be what we're going to talk about, what you're saying about women being a commodity. We're basically making women irrelevant. So we're having this whole conversation last night about, and here today, with sex trafficking women. Maybe there's men. You can tell me if there's not, but probably way more women, 95 or 98%. And now we're making them irrelevant in sports. So where do women, and without women, you and I aren't here. Like the peace drop that you said, God, Jesus, whoever you believe, and you're listening to this, I don't care, the spiritual world.
Yep.
Somehow someone made a woman, and it, like, pretty amazing thing that you can grow a human.
Yeah.
Right? Like, crazy. And we're basically just minimizing, we're making women disappear. And this isn't about women in heels and all this sex stuff. It's basically just respecting that position in the world.
Yeah.
So, sorry, it was on my mind, and it's a
No.
parallel to what you're saying though about making women
And
a commodity.
and we're going to go back and forth between looking at this from a macro level to a micro level, and the macro level is women's rights, women's health. I mean, some of these things that you and I are now thrust in. I don't have an opinion about the transgender community, but you're going to force me to have
Well,
one when you start violating women's rights. Like, I'm sorry. I feel like we need to protect women and women's rights, for all of known mankind, that there's been men and there's been women. Now we're introducing some new concepts, and I got it. But we have to protect
you,
women's rights.
right? You can't
And
encroach on I mean, make a third thing.
right,
I do not care.
concur. And then it's women's health as well. So as you commoditize women and you try to convince women and convince men that their bodies can be used for profit, sex for profit, it has really heavy deleterious effects physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And those are things I'm trying to protect as well. Now, a lot of this is based on abuse. There's a lot of sexual abuse that's happening in homes. There's a lot of sexual abuse that's happening
Especially with COVID.
with these exactly. It's happening in our schools, in our churches, on our sports teams. It's happening in the dating world. The sexual abuse is absolutely breaking down the confidence, and the
Yeah, what was the
identity.
statistic you said? 1 in 4 women or 1 in 3 women have
I
been raped.
It's been 1 in 4 women, and I think it's encroaching on 1 in 3.
It blew my
Now,
mind.
when you talk about sexually abused or sexually assaulted, and you can define that in a lot of different ways. It's grabbing somebody's chest, or whatever. It's almost 100% of women have had to endure unwanted sexual advances that were just simply inappropriate. So
Blows
there's
your mind, Jeff.
and the base of that pyramid is ginormous, right? And there's only so much I can do, because that's a cultural thing, but as you go building up off this pyramid, where I'm standing at, and what we're focused on, is the commercial sexual exploitation of women and children. So it's sex for profit. And very specifically, what we look at with Skull Games is the online sex market. So sex is being sold all over the United States. It's being sold in strip clubs. It's being sold at brothels. It's being sold on the street. I mean, sex is for sale everywhere. But what we've come upon, and again, this goes back to the base of what we've been talking about today, is strategy, right? How can I be in more places at one time than the physical piece? So if I was focused where we are at Half Moon Bay, or I was focused in LA, I have to physically be there, right? I have to observe what's happening
For like a
online.
street person who's selling sex on the
Yeah,
corner of whatever.
yep. It's just like, take hunting. If you're going to hunt an area now, what do people do? They put up cameras. They watch cameras. They get online and they read what other hunters talk about. Where's the good hunting? So all of this virtual world lives online, and there is an entire sex economy that lives online. And you can purchase a girl in any city, in any town in the United States, like that. Like I often say, it's like ordering a pizza. And what you're looking at too, now we're going back to some of these business principles. It's not that many of these men want a child, right? So we got to play the numbers. This is what I like about business. And again, when I talk about the way you and I have talked about things with entrepreneurship and understanding business, you're playing the odds. You're understanding what's happening there, and you're understanding these markets, right? So I wanted to correct one thing that you said earlier with the sex industry. There are women of all races, and unfortunately, brown and black women are overly represented in trafficking. This is one of those things that
Oh, well, yeah. I think I was pulling from what you were saying last
yeah.
night. Maybe we can
So
add some color to
yeah,
that.
so yeah, well again,
Because
there's just
listeners weren't privy to that.
yeah, there's a tiny bit of nuance,
Yeah.
So unequivocally, every research that's been out there are more Hispanic and African American women trapped in this crime of sex trafficking than Caucasian and Asian women.
Oh, okay.
So to me, it's one of those things that there are many aspects of our culture that are trying to reach down and provide opportunity for Hispanic, Latinx, whatever you're calling these folks now, and African American women. And yet we turn a blind eye to the fact that there are more of them being trafficked and abused and held in sexual slavery than at any point in time in the planet. Now, what we were talking about yesterday also is, again, when you're talking about these commodities, the white woman goes for more money. Okay. So each stable, a pimp usually has a stable statistically of 5 or 6 girls. Almost always they're going to have a couple of white women because they charge more for white women, you know? So a bunch of the cases that I've worked with, you will see these traffickers recruit white girls from rural towns and bring them to the big city. And then they'll take their, they call them brown and black girls, Hispanic and African American girls, and they'll bring them to these rural towns, and they'll try to sell the brown and black girls for a higher cost because it's an exotic event for some guy in the rural. But
weird.
But the white woman, the white girl, goes for just a little bit more money. Okay. Now, I hope that people are listening to this are pissed off that
we're talking about
this.
Humans.
Yeah, we're talking about humans. We're putting a price, and you want to talk about racial inequality and all of that. Like it exists in the sexual, in this commodity. A brown and black girl is treated like garbage. Okay. She's in many times they're half the cost. They're 2/3 the price of a white girl. So why I bring that up is in these inner city communities and the places, the suburbs where we grew up, all these families think, oh, we don't have it out here. Oh, you do. They want your daughter. They want that healthy white American girl who's a cheerleader or on the debate team or whatever. They want that girl because they can sell her for more. And when you think about the buyer, what does the buyer want? The buyer wants that experience. He wants the cheerleader. He wants the this, the that. He wants a young, pretty, vivacious girl that's going to perform circus sex acts with them. Like that. That's what they're paying for.
Like the thing that I'm dawning on me, we're literally talking about slavery in America right now.
Yeah. And I have a love-hate relationship with this idea of equating human trafficking to modern day slavery, because on one hand, it absolutely is. You're buying and selling human beings, or you're renting them, and they make nothing. It all goes to their pimp or their trafficker. So I think it's a really good way.
What's the other side?
Because it's just such a loaded term with slavery. And
I don't think it's equivalent. It's different, but the same.
Yeah. But it just, as soon as
we're not minimizing that to say that this is the same thing. But if you own a human and you are selling them or making them work, that's slavery.
Yeah. And they're doing it in the most degrading, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually denigrating way possible. I mean, a sex act, and again, this is okay. People can try to reduce sex to just something that's physical.
Oh, well, it's a mental,
there's a lot more to it. So if you are engaging in some sort of sex act with another human being, you're giving a piece of yourself to them every time. And again, if you can say it's a piece of your soul, it's a piece of your karma, it's a piece of whatever. You're giving a piece of yourself away every time, and it's really, really hard to reclaim that. So I again, looking at this from business principles, who are the buyers? Who are the sellers? Where is the market? And then this goes back to the strategy. How do we encroach upon that market, disrupt, and isolate what it is we're trying to affect against that market? And I'm taking the counterterrorism, counterinsurgency principles that we've perfected all across the globe and trying to apply that to this very specific target set of the commercial sex, the illicit commercial sex that's happening online everywhere you look.
And your model has been to take people who are coming out of the military or intelligence space and put them together. Hopefully they could make a living or be compensated, at a minimum, give back and use these skill sets that are not readily used out in the civilian world and hunt them down. And originally you were doing this less in a game
Mm-hmm.
way,
Mm-hmm.
but basically as an ongoing, hey, I've got my office, you had a team,
Yeah.
you had a small
Yeah.
operating team, right? Can you explain a little bit how you were doing that? And then we can talk about what you're doing with the games.
Yep. So I hope this doesn't feel like rambling to people. You know, I mean, you and I are just we're talking, but
Yeah.
there are these themes and these threads that are running
I'm
throughout.
trying to
And
keep the theme going.
well, yeah, but one of the themes in the threads, again, if people think back to, is we're talking about what we did in the military and these task forces. So I've taken what we've learned as a task force, which is taking in professionals in the intelligence community, the operations community, and you're building these teams that are complementary to each other. So we call it the Skull Games. We call it the Skull Games Task Force, and it's also this concept of a surge, right? So just like if people harken back to what I talked about before, where the Delta Force had to open its doors. We only have so many operators, right? There's only ever going to be X percentage because it's just really fucking hard to get there and stay there. So how do you expand your influence? So you've got to bring other people in that aren't held to the same Delta Force standard, but they're an expert in their own space, they're an expert in their field, and they want to participate in this task force. So we have these task forces overseas that were led by Rangers or Special Forces or Delta Force that had people by the thousands. And it was Coast Guard, it was civilians, it was all sorts of people that opted in. You know, some people were, you were assigned, you're going to this task force, but most people, it was this community of interest that opted in to be part of this task force that really understood how to get all of this talent focused in one direction. And even when we think of the wars with the surges, right? When we've surged in Iraq and we had successes, you can't maintain a surge. Like that's why you have a surge. So what we have done is we've taken those same principles that I've experienced for a couple decades in the military, and we've laid those same concepts over counter trafficking. So I have hunters within Skull Games. They hunt every day, and it's only a couple people because one, I can only afford a couple people. Like they have a salary, and they get up in the morning and they get on escort ads and they hunt from morning till night, and they're identifying these girls that are being sold online all across the country in all these cities where we have a law enforcement that will take that lead. So we have people that are hunting every single day, putting these leads together. So one, I can only afford so many, and two, there's other people that have different interests. So the Skull Games is a surge effort. We come together as a task force every couple months, and people come from all over the country. And most of them are intel professionals, right? Many of them, they don't want to stare at this crime day in and day out. Would you? The people that work with me, they do this 8-10 hours a day, but they just have the ability to manage
Well, they
all
were
of the
doing that
gross.
in a
Right,
career
right. So that's what Skull Games is all
because it's
about.
sort of depressing.
It, but that's why it's gamified. We'll come back to that. So that's what Skull Games does. We hunt every single day, and we can find 4, 5, 6, 8 leads a week. We can identify different women that are being sold that we believe are
Do you
being
want to talk
trafficked.
about what you do with that, with the package you put together?
Yep. So this information, it's all found online. And the start point is this escort site, this escort ad. So we look at these ads, we identify these indicators. I won't talk into them about them
Yep.
in detail about why we think this woman isn't a prostitute, but we actually think she's being exploited and manipulated by a trafficker. So that's our start point, is the ad. We identify who that girl is, which now makes it real also. So I know you because we've spent time together, and I know your history, and I know your wife, and I know your hobbies. It's important for law enforcement to understand some of these women, because they're not just prostitutes and they're not just victims. They're women and they're girls and they're human beings, and they have a story. And you have to understand and know that story to be able to understand how to relate to them and how to help them out of the predicament that they're in. So when you talk about probable cause and reasonable suspicion, it's a different measurement all over the country. Every city, every county, every town is going to consider something just slightly different. So what we call it is a compelling story. So we need to create a compelling story so that this law enforcement officer, this detective at whatever level, gets that lead and he gives a shit. And then on the backside of it, the victim advocates that are ultimately going to meet with this young lady, they understand where she comes from, who she is, and what it is she needs. So we have these, the first part is this true identity. It's this compelling story. And then we're really trying to move towards that threshold of probable cause, reasonable suspicion. Because if a cop has reasonable probable cause, he can go act, right? And really what we're trying to get at is the trafficker. So right
As I
now,
said, there's two pronged. It's one, rescue the person
yep,
potentially,
yep,
which I'll let you talk about, which is super hard because of Stockholm syndrome. And then there's two, go to the source and
yep.
cut off the head.
And as we are focusing more and more on the predators, we're finding more and more success. So I would say somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the start points now that we go off of, which is just an ad. It's a woman being sold online. Half to 2/3 of those that we bring to completion, we're finding what we're calling is the person of interest. Again, I have to be careful, right? I don't want to call someone a pimp and a trafficker. We call them persons of interest, but they're pieces of shit. It should be POSs, not POIs. So, and we send that packet then to law enforcement. So now they are able to understand and get access into the electronic storage of certain things for these traffickers. They can write a warrant and talk to a judge because all this evidence that we've presented them, they now can get a warrant and get inside that guy's phone and inside their messenger.
But one thing I want to elaborate on, Jeff, just for the listeners, is it's not as easy as just you do the package. When you give the package to the law enforcement, FBI, whoever it is, they need to be able to recreate that case themselves, click for click, because they can't take evidence that you, which to be very clear for listeners, are not a law enforcement anything. You're an intel unit, basically, that is volunteer. Not, you're a nonprofit that's doing this on a volunteer basis. And you have to create these packets that not only do you find the evidence, but that you can give them in this very detailed way that they can recreate the evidence themselves. So I just want to say that because I think not saying it, your work is very in-depth and detailed.
And that's important because we call it the path of discovery. That path of discovery has to be replicable by that law enforcement agent. And that's what's different than just like a Crime Stoppers. We're not Crime Stoppers on steroids. Okay, we're not. Like, you see something, you get on Crime Stoppers, you report it, or this, this tip line that you can send it. Look, unfortunately, folks, very few of those things are ever even looked at or read because it's just another tasker. It's another responsibility that the cop has to go to. We never want to be a tasker for law enforcement. We never want to be some squeaky wheel. We want to give them the evidence and the information that they need to really get their teeth into a case. The other side of that too was all of these law enforcement that we work with, we're in relationship with. So big surprise, right? What's the hardest thing of anything we do? It's the relationships. So we have a tried and tested process right now that we've refined over the course of 10 years. That is it's solid. I mean, these things they're going to court and pimps are being prosecuted. Traffickers are going away. Cops it's really easy for them to understand. So our processes are solid. It's the relationships that are always the things that ebb and flow and lag. Because when I hand you a lead, you have to know me a little bit. You have to know about my integrity and our attention to detail and our discipline. I also have to know something about you. We aren't giving leads to cops so they can arrest prostitutes. I mean, that is not the last thing we want is for a prostitute to be arrested and charged. Now, I understand sometimes when you're engaging with these women, the best thing for them is to arrest them on the spot, take them back to the station, and try to suss some things out. Try to protect her, try to understand what's happening. I get all that. But they're victims. That's our going in point. A prostitute is a victim. Are some of these prostitutes out there actively involved in running other women? And have they pivoted now from a victim to actually another predator? Sure. But my going in position is they're a victim. And the cops that we work with have to have that same point of view. The other point of view is that all pimps are traffickers. That's the going in point of view that we have. Because when you're talking about the difference between pimping and trafficking, The legal term is force, fraud, or coercion. If you're using force, fraud, or coercion to force somebody to conduct a sex act for money, that's not pimping anymore. That's trafficking. So I would argue every pimp is a trafficker. It just depends on the evidence that you're able to build. So that's the point that we try to make is the cops we work with see these women as victims first until they are absolutely convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that they need to address her in a different way, and that all these traffickers are pimps. Because going back to some of the stuff we were just discussing with culture, we've kind of glamorized this idea of a pimp. Pimp my ride, pimp my pad, all these kind. I mean, all in music and in common culture, but we haven't glamorized traffickers. And if our listeners can kind of think about this, what a pimp does is he has a stable of women that he controls, and he arranges sex dates for them. That's what he does. That's a pretty vanilla point of view. But he controls them, he coerces them, he uses force, fraud, and coercion for them to make a profit that he then keeps. That's trafficking. And if you don't think every pimp is a trafficker, it's time to wake up.
Well, they do some really dirty tricks you were talking about. They will have sex with the woman to have a kid, and then they keep the kid, which basically keeps the woman prisoner. I mean, let's like unpack this a little bit. This isn't just that simple. They're not they beat them, they do all these other things, probably keep them on drugs and 6 other things, but they literally have kids with these women, which any mother is going to be loyal. Like, that's some sick shit, Jeff. I mean, that's some twisted, sick shit.
But it's also brilliant in a diabolical way. That's what I mean. Like these guys, and this goes back to what we were talking about with the strategy, right? So when a trafficker has sex with his victim with the intent of her having a baby, that's a piece of leverage that he has over her forever. Like she's had at that point, you know? And then many of these traffickers, while she's pregnant, now you're talking about commodity, you're talking about business, her price goes up because so now she's being sold on these fetish sites. So when these women are pregnant, they're not working. They're not putting their feet up and working through this pregnancy. They're still having sex every single day.
Yeah, these people are just twisted as fuck.
And then they take that baby and they use that baby as a piece of leverage for that woman to go out and conduct all of these.
It just makes you angry.
And here's another one. In many states, right? You have to register who's the daddy of that baby, the baby daddy. Who's the baby daddy? Okay. So in the state, this child is born. The woman has to say who the baby daddy is. Baby daddy signs some paperwork. If that woman leaves the state with that child, by law, that baby daddy has to be contacted. Yep. So same with the benefits. The benefits will be split in many times in different cities and states across the United States between the mother and the baby daddy for that child. So these guys are playing the game
and getting money, and probably from child services.
Exactly. So that's pretty diabolical. The other one that I really didn't see coming, Brandon, and I saw it a little bit overseas. Some of these suicide bombers were mentally handicapped people, and they were convinced to
brainwashed
to go and go blow themselves up and that kind of thing. I saw some of that. Traffickers, no, it's not huge, again, because again, keep going back to commodity, right? How many men want to have sex with a clearly mentally handicapped woman? That's not that many people, okay? But now you think of it from the trafficker's point of view. He has this mentally handicapped woman who's 24 years old. She's got the mind of an 8-year-old. She's got the mind of a 12-year-old. So he can manipulate and control her like she's a child, but she's not a minor. She's a grown woman. So there is a level of mentally handicapped women that are being exploited out there simply because they're easy to control.
Which they programmed.
And going back to our experience in the military, one of the schools we go to is SERE, SERE, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, SERE schools. I've been through a bunch of them. And you learn how to resist interrogation. You learn how to resist brainwashing. You learn how to be on the other side, to elicit information. And I can take a beating. You can beat me all day, and you're not going to get much information from me. You start cutting up my nuts, maybe I'll start talking. You know what I mean? But you cut my fingers off, and do whatever, like whatever. But as soon as you bring in a friend, and you start abusing my friend, that was really, really hard. So for me to take the physical pain, again, it's military school, right?
I
What's the
understand.
torture? They're slapping you around. You're getting, stress positions, being cold water, that kind of thing. But to watch my friends suffer because I'm withholding a piece of information,
Even acting.
Well, yeah, that's really hard. So that's the other thing that people need to understand. There's a reason pimps and traffickers have a stable, because me hurting someone else because you aren't following the rules, that's some diabolical shit.
Well, they do that in sports teams. Somebody does something bad and you all do sprints all day.
Yep.
It's the same.
Exactly. It's the same psychology. So that's what folks need to understand, is that's the way they manipulate it. So if you don't come back with the quota that you were supposed to make, you're not getting punished. Your sister wife, someone else in the family, they call it. So again, it's this idea, people know the pimp is called daddy, the girls are family, sister wives. They call it the life. The pimp calls it the game. So you can understand the psychological structure that these guys are creating with the life in the game. And that's where we, with Skull Games, we've also turned it into a game. We've turned the hunt into a game. So just like these other things that you see out there with hackathons or capture the flag or these different, computer exercises, these black hat things. Yeah, computer games themselves. So we have gamified the hunt. So if somebody comes to Skull Games and they participate in one of our games, we help them understand what the crime looks like. We help them understand how to leverage open source intelligence, OSINT. That's predominantly what we use to figure out all this information. They score points on what they're able to find. If you find a woman's true identity, her birthday, where she lives, where her trafficker lives, you just start racking up points. And the teams compete against each other. So we have a team leader who is an experienced intel person. Many of them are out of the military or still in the military. We have a law enforcement agent that's on that team. And then we also have a survivor to hunter. So we have women that were trafficking victims that have now come out of that life and have been trained in open source intel and how to work within that teamwork. And their lived experience, knowledge, and the wisdom that they have is absolutely amazing. So these teams are pitted against each other. We have fun. They find this information. They come and brief the fusion cell, which is just like we had overseas, right? Intel person shows up. Hey, Brandon, here's the target I think you guys should go after. And it's like, okay, sell me. What do you have? Why should I go after this target? Who is it? What is it? What's the compelling story? And that was the same thing that I developed when I was in the military. I didn't really know what were the details. Maybe we were hunting a phone. Maybe we had human intelligence that was reporting on something. But my point was, you need to have a compelling story. You need to convince me that I'm going to jump on a motherfucking helicopter with 10 of my buddies and land in the middle of this hornet's nest to capture or kill this guy. So it's the things that we've learned through the years, through developing these task forces, through these intelligence and operations fusion to hunt predators. We've just applied that all into the Skull Games, specifically to the online commercial sex industry.
And it's worth mentioning that while someone listening to might say, well, I'm going to show up, I want to do that. You do require, and I know you're going to eventually, I mean, your small task force unit here, do training, but you really do require at some level having known or know how to do OSINT, not because you don't want the manpower, but because you don't have the manpower to manage to teach someone while you're trying to hunt someone. And there are some, I mean, maybe it's worth mentioning, Jeff, like I don't know whether Cynthia or something, there's classes out there that you can take if you're listening to this and you feel compelled to volunteer or play a part in these games. you can take, there are some open source intelligence classes, aren't they? Like we
Yep.
could point people towards, I could put it in the show notes with
Yeah.
Cynthia or
Yep.
whoever's training that.
Yeah. We, Cynthia Hetherington, who runs a Hetherington group, she's on our board. Buddy Jericho, who he's been in a bunch of different businesses with OSINT. He now runs Indalgo Technologies. We are very much tied in with the OSINT community.
But there's a course, right? Isn't there
Yep.
somewhere that they can take?
Yep. So again, OSINT Academy, there's all sorts of them. But if they go to our website, skullgames.io, you can apply to be part of the team. And we want to see a resume, again, just to understand who you are. And then we will end up doing a background check. And then pending your experience, we'll direct you towards these different courses. So originally, and where we want to get back to, this idea was this democratized hunting, right? Like everybody that's interested in it can do it. I don't care if you're the 70-year-old tennis shoe wearing grandma, you know what I mean, or the Delta Force Intel analyst who wants to do this on their free time. It's to democratize all of this. It's to build this community of interest. We actually call it vetted crowdsourcing. So there is a little bit of vetting we need to do. Obviously, we don't want any sheep or any wolves in the sheep pen, right?
Of course.
But right now, because we are kicking off and refining what we're doing, we really need the Intel professionals that have this background. But it will ebb and flow. The dream is that we kind of have a balance of the pros and the amateurs, and they learn from each other. So for the rest of this year, the Skull Games that we have in July and October, July is going to be in Jersey, October is in New Orleans. We're not taking a lot of volunteers, but that is not to dissuade you from going to our website, skullgames.io, and submitting, because a lot of this is you opt in, man. You want to become an OSINT professional? Have at it, opt in, and we will show you the resources that you need.
I think one thing worth mentioning that maybe possibly is how my life took a change, got into it all, is you actually don't have to even have been in the military. I'm just mentioning this for listeners, because if you are doing things online and you're a marketer, a good marketer, meaning you're in the weeds, doing Facebook ads, understand the data marts, all these things that someone listening is making sense what I'm saying right now, then you can be an OSINT person, because inherently you are hunting people. They're just customers.
Yeah.
And that was something that I learned a long time ago when it was told to me, like, you actually hunt people. And I was like, well, I never really thought about it that way, but I guess it's true. So if you're out there and you're listening to this and you want to be part, and there's some really cool people like you, I mean, you've been in some world events that, you can hang out and learn. I'm not a big war story guy. You know that, like, I just don't think that, I don't know. I think that gets done too much, but if you're out there and you want to volunteer and you do have some experience in that, that skill set is applicable here.
Yeah. Sign up. We'll be honest with you. Hey, not right now. Here's what you need.
You'll be brutally honest. I think that's what you guys are known for.
Well, and as we
get bigger,
develop and get bigger and have more funding, it's going to be a wider and wider tent, and conversely more and more focused, so. And the other thing, Brandon, and I know I really want you to come out and see one. There's something magical that happens. Like I every time we've done 7 Skull Games to date, so we've been developing this.
Yeah, I didn't even know that when you told me that when we talked a week ago.
Well, as I was building this with the previous nonprofit I was with, we were going to launch it in October as a complimentary effort. Yeah. So we were just kind of, we were iterating, again, the things that you and I talked about, iterate, don't overanalyze it. Just go out there and do it. And I would tell you, the last game that we had in Tampa, we nailed it. So they've all been good, but our first Skull Games, I think we had 5 or 6 people that were in person. And then we also have people online. So that's the other balance, is you don't have to come in person. You can participate virtually. And we have teams, and a lot of people, like, they'll have a house and they'll be in some other city, and that's what they're doing. They're buying pizza, they're drinking beer, and they're hunting from home, and they're integrated into the whole thing. So what I envision is ultimately we're going to have hundreds of people in person and hundreds of people online, all hunting and surging these efforts. And can you imagine what that would do to disrupt and destabilize this sex industry when we reach that level of critical mass.
Well, they will eventually realize
Yeah.
that it's not going to be as easy. And they actually have professionals. I mean, you're doing, and I know we talked in the first hour here about your background, but I thought it was really important to understand because there's so many things that that you've taken and that I don't think listeners always understand can be brought from the military. Like you're talking iterating. Well, all the units you've been a part of for the most part,
Mhm.
especially the last ones, that's what you guys do. You're taught to go.
Yeah.
That's the same thing we do in startups.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
stop. Yes, you plan.
Yeah.
You do have to write a bit, quote unquote, a business plan,
Yep.
but you also have to get out of your way
Yep.
after you've written that thing and actually see if it put
Yeah.
it on the X.
Exactly.
And does it work? And if it doesn't, you come back, you figure out in your guys' world a hot wash, and you go back the next day and you say, did that work? Or, and I think that you're doing the same thing in what you're building with Skull Games.
And what I think people don't realize about Delta Force also, we talked about Rangers and Special Forces, right? Like, yeah, predominantly the assaulters and the operators are coming from those units. But the thing that makes Delta what it is you can be in any of DOD. You can be Coast Guard, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, reserves.
Oh yeah, anybody can try.
Anybody can try out for Delta Force. So we have this wide pool. Some of the best operators that I can think of. One was a hard hat diver in the Navy. He was a hard hat diver. Another guy was a helicopter mechanic. Another guy was a cook.
A mechanic.
A helicopter mechanic.
Became an operator.
So you, again, Delta Force has democratized the opportunity. Doesn't matter. All you have to do is be in DOD and you can try out for the unit. So we've taken that same idea for Skull Games. I wanted to democratize that. And we have people from all different walks of life. And I'm so humbled, dude, because like it's almost like I can't, I'm sure you can relate this in your own way. So we hold the Skull Games and it's like, well, no one's going to come. Well, I know who's coming because to a degree, because they sign up.
Right?
But every time we set it up, I stand there in awe and I'm just like, man, these people are coming from all over the country on their own dime for a weekend to help someone else. Yes, we've made it fun. Yes, you're learning and you're taking skills that you can apply to other things. But by and large, it really is just the altruism is so humbling. The other thing I would say is a lot of the people that come in person have suffered some level of trauma and abuse. And it's a cathartic experience for them to be around others that have suffered in a similar way that we are just starting to talk about a little bit more openly in the United States. But then to be able to pivot that pain into hunting and helping someone else, I get goosebumps, dude. Like I'm the creator of this, and it still boggles my mind every time.
Well, I think you finally got it, Jeff, because when we talked a few weeks ago, and I know I was like, Jeff, you got to get on here. I want to talk about human trafficking. I haven't had anybody on human trafficking until now because I wanted to talk to you. And I know you had a plan, but I know you had a plan. I think you nailed it this time, mainly because it's gamifying. You and I talked a little bit last night with dinner with Yvette with Arnold Schwarzenegger said recently about climate change. He said, stop talking about climate change. Mm-hmm. Nobody gives a shit about climate change. They care about pollution. Mm-hmm. And if you say we have smoke or we have this in the ocean, like that's something someone gets their head around. They're like, oh, what does that cause? And I think what you've done with the game and relating this to not this invisible thing, because mm-hmm. it's invisible to most people, is it's really a women's health issue, right? This is health, not just physical, but mentally. Like it's not just this other thing that is, it's almost like these things that they're so high level and they're really hard to get your head around what that means.
Yeah.
But,
and again, I don't know if this is the end. We're probably getting close to the end, but the other thing,
the end is whenever it ends.
When we talk about Skull Games, we've talked a little bit about my book. When we've talked about my military career, I came to terms early on. One, that I'm a protector. I'm a commando. I'm an assaulter. That's what I do. My job was never to win wars. My job was to win battles. My job was to pluck bad people off of the planet and to provide a certain level of security and freedom for those that are around that individual. And that's one of the things, again, that I want people to understand and know. And these veterans that are out there that are suffering, your job was not to win the war. Yeah, it's heartbreaking the way we left Afghanistan. I haven't been in a winning war since Panama of '89. I was back in Panama a couple of years ago, and it's beautiful, and I feel good, and I can walk the land where I jumped in. I can walk the land where I had gunfights, and it's thriving, and those people are free. I can go to Iraq, and I can go to Kurdistan, and I can see the things, the fruits of my labor. Did we win Iraq? I don't know. Did we win Afghanistan? Indubitably no. Okay, but the people that are hurting and can't get past that feeling of betrayal or wasting your time, you have to understand it's the fight that matters. It's the fight. You were in the fight. And when you got knocked down, you got up and you continued to fight. And that's the same idea that we have with Skull Games. Yes, of course, it's bringing freedom to these women. It's bringing justice to these predators for profit. But that is a very delayed gratification. These women go through months and years of restoration before they're finally free.
Yeah, I was going to ask you when you said the women that you do have come that help.
They're years out of it.
Yeah. What's the key to rescuing them that you've seen? Like, how do they? What breaks? Is there something, one thing, or is it just across the board different? Like how you get someone out of that?
It's across the board, and that woman has to be ready. You know what I mean? Like she has to be ready
done,
to,
basically.
yeah, and to take those risks. Because like we talked about, her life is at risk. Her friends, the women that she worked with, her family. So she has to be at a point where she's just done with it. And you have to give them a certain sense of security and safety. That's why arresting the trafficker is so important. It's very, very hard for this woman to make this choice on this path to freedom. And then the path is so long, and it's a cycle. They go forward, they go back, because many of them, like you talked about, are kicking addictions. They're kicking brainwashing. They have TBIs and brain traumas and things that veterans have learned to deal with too. It's an interesting community between the veterans and these survivors, trauma survivors. There's a kinship there that's really interesting to see. So that's that concept again, where at Skull Games, we've gamified it, so you are winning, right? Like you get points, and there's prizes.
How many packages do you were telling last night, like like how many packages on not the women but the traffickers are coming out of that?
So right now, with the manpower that we have, we're around 40 to 50 lead packets on the women and about 25 to 30 on the traffickers.
And that's a lot, though. Because how many other places are producing this result? I'm not putting down any other organization. I'm just saying I haven't heard about it.
And at the quality that we have. And the thing people need to understand is there are certain, these cities get overwhelmed. They can only handle a couple cases at once because now it's in the judicial process. So we have to jump around. So when I say we're hunting out of Tampa, or our next hunt is going to be in New Jersey, we're not necessarily hunting in New Jersey. We're hunting all across the country. That's the beauty again of this.
You're just getting together in New Jersey.
Yes, that's where we're collective. So yes, the gamification I think is fun, and you leave there with an intrinsic, not just an intrinsic sense of self-worth, but you've been rewarded for your work. But again, the book that I wrote, why I'm on this podcast, what we've created with Skull Games, is people knowing themselves, understanding who they are and what their purpose is, and finding that fight that you're passionate about. And I will get in the ring, and you can lock that gate behind me, and I will fight. And I will not win every time, and I will get knocked down, but I will get the fuck back up, and I will dust myself off, and I will continue to fight. And that is where I find the pleasure. I find the pleasure in the pain. I find the contentment in the fight. You can't get bogged down with these ultimate results. When you and I are standing before the Creator, and we're being judged, you're not being judged on what you actually accomplished. You're being judged on, did you get in the fight? Did you even enter the arena? Did you get marred by blood, sweat, dust, and tears. One of my favorite quotes from Teddy Roosevelt. Were you just a critic who stood on the sidelines, or did you get in the arena and fight for someone else? And we're trying to create that arena for people to come in and protect and defend the vulnerable.
I think it's cool. Just the book comes out in July.
I hope so. I'm going to see what the unit has to say about it. Hopefully, there aren't too many black lines or big red marks that say you can't talk about this. Everything is set. I was ready to publish it before I sent it in for this final check. So I'm hoping July, maybe as late as August. But
in there again, just for listeners, you take Bible lessons and then match them with your journey as an operator, effectively, and sort of tell that story how it is. And I will say that last night at dinner, we were talking to Yvette and I, and then even before we went to bed, you were talking about the David and Goliath, and the front of your book, which I think is a really good design, has 5 marbles on it for David Goliath. And my question to you was, why are there 5 marbles? And you're like, well, he actually had to kill 4 other people. So can you just share that little story? Because I think that David and Goliath is a story from the Bible that people know, but this is just like it's a teaser, because your whole book is 27 chapters of this type of stuff that I didn't learn in Sunday school.
So when I was in Israel walking the land, again, because it's part of my faith tradition, I'm a history buff, archaeology. I mean, to me, it's just a fascinating story. If you haven't dug into the Bible just as a piece of literature, you're an idiot, because it's fascinating history. You know what I mean? You don't have to believe it's God inspired, words, but it's history, and it's culture, and it's lessons for life, and all these things. So anyway, walking this land, I'm at the Valley of Elah, where David killed Goliath, and there's the archaeological evidence of it, and then there's all this tradition that's stacked on top of it. And it was one of those stories that I started reading. And even this ties in with what we were talking about. So if you read the Bible story, so the way the book is structured is there will be the Bible story itself. If you're not familiar with it, you'll read the Bible story. And then I will pluck out all these little pieces that you probably hadn't thought about or you read past, and researching what other people have thought about that or commented on, or what I have kind of concluded by myself through my soldier's eyes. So it's the story, it's more to the story, and then it'll be the soldier's perspective of what I went through, kind of in a somewhat equitable way. So even with David, it talks about when David shows up, he's the runt of the litter, and his brothers are all in Elah Valley. It's about 7-8 miles away from where he lives, and his dad sends him down to give his brothers some cheese and bread and some food, because they've been on the front lines. And David walks down there, and he's too young, he's too small to be a soldier, and he hears Goliath berating the Israelite army, and he wants man-on-man combat. Like, instead of the Philistines and the Israelites fighting each other and a lot of guys dying, they want it to be, you bring out our champion, we'll bring out our champion, winner takes it all. Well, he'd been doing this for 40 days. And David shows up and he's like, this is bullshit. Like, how come nobody is facing this guy? But the thing too that it talks about is David had killed a lion and a bear previously. So in David's experience as a shepherd, he had already killed a lion and a bear. And you can only assume he did that with a sling, right? So a lion and a bear has got to be pretty hard to kill with a sling compared to a human.
Yeah, I'm thinking so.
So again, know yourself, be prepared, and be ready. This wasn't David's first rodeo. Can we assume he was maimed and hurt when he killed that lion and a bear? Probably. So it's just that little line that David had previously killed a lion and a bear, and you blow right through it. But it's like, no. The writer of this story, who I believe God is giving us life lessons, but if it isn't God himself, the writer of the story is telling you, hey, dude, don't be so lazy. What did I just tell you? Think of everything that goes into that. This young man had been tested, and he had been found worthy. So he knew himself, he knew who he was, he knew what his commitment to God was, and he volunteers to go face Goliath. He tries to put on Saul says, "Put on this armor. It's all too big. It's ridiculous." He's a slinger. He's a stone thrower. So he goes down to the river and he pulls out 5 smooth stones and he puts them in his bag, and then he goes to confront Goliath. So here we are again. Why in this piece of literature, either God breathed or the author himself is highlighting that David selected 5 stones? Why is that in there? There's a lot to talk about. Well, David knew his enemy. If you read through the Bible, and there are other traditions that have looked at this, many people believe that Goliath had 4 brothers. There were 5 giants from this town called Gath, which is where Goliath was from. So not only was David so confident in how he had been tested and tried and found worthy, and of his skills as a sniper with the sling, he didn't expect to just kill Goliath. He believed that he was going to have to avenge Goliath to each 4 of his brothers. So this is a perfect example in one simple story of a young man who knew himself and he knew his enemy, and he did not fear the battle that was before him.
Because he was prepared.
He was prepared.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I know you got to get down and go down the coast and visit some other people. Jeff, the book comes out, Where Have All the Heroes Gone, in July. So we'll put a link in the show notes to your main website where people can find that, skullgames.io. And I didn't prepare you for this one, but you think on the spot. So if you had to give 3 pieces of advice to listeners about life, from your life as a warrior, for your life in after that, and just your life as Jeff, the human husband, father, what 3 things would you boil it all down to?
Well, that's easy because we've been talking about it. Know yourself, know your enemy, and be prepared. Okay. But knowing yourself can really only come with hardship and endurance. There has to be physical, mental, and even times a moral hardship that you have to go through. So in this culture where things are pretty comfortable, you've got to get out there and suffer. And I think we're seeing pieces of that, right? You've got to go out and do that walkabout. You've got to suffer. And within that suffering, you will learn things about yourself. So when you are in the midst of suffering, don't feel sorry for yourself. Okay. Recognize that this is a hardening, a period of time where you're going to come out understanding yourself. Knowing your enemy, it's the enemy within. Know your strengths and weaknesses. These relationships. I mean, I've been able to spend so much more time in the last few years understanding my strengths and weaknesses as a father, as a husband. And there's a lot I don't like what I see, and I would say with men specifically, the biggest weakness that men have is pride and ego. I mean, it's the base of everything. It was the fall in Eden. It was the fall in heaven when Lucifer fell. It's pride. So men really need to check their pride. And if you're doing anything in your life because it's feeding your pride and ego, then stop what you're doing, take a step back, and try to level all that out. And if you do those 2 things even moderately correctly, you'll be prepared for what life throws at you.
Well, we can't drop the mic, but I think that was the mic drop. Skull.io. We'll put everything in the show notes. Jeff, thanks a lot, man. It's been fun to catch up.
Great to see you, brother. Appreciate everything.
Bye, everyone.